Hello, this is Derek from One Over Tea. Welcome back to another episode of Tea Soup, a podcast all about tea culture, life in modern China, and Chinese tea. I'm your host, Derek Poskin. I've been living in China since 2016, and I've been drinking, buying, and selling Chinese tea for the past decade. So, pop on that kettle, heat up your teaware, and let's get this session started. Alright, before we begin, I want to give a quick shout out to my buddy Dart from teaware and talk about a podcast that we're doing. It's a video podcast every week, and we're releasing them a bit out of schedule, so I just recorded the one that we'll release in 2 weeks now. This podcast is called Between the Cracks, which is a reference to the Kaipian effect that happens with Ruyao glazed tea, where the more you brew it, the more cracks appear, and the tea actually stains into these cracks, making your teaware look beautiful. And so just another thing, like the patina of a teapot, the more you use it, the more beautiful it gets. And hopefully the more we do this podcast, the more we talk about teaware, tea culture, and all that, the better it will get. So right now it's on YouTube. You can check it out on the Tao Teaware YouTube channel. It's called Between the Cracks is the podcast. So that's a video podcast if you want to actually see my face when I'm talking. Right now, let's continue with this Tea Soup podcast. So the last episode was a deep dive into the making of Dancong Oolong. I told you guys about my experience on the mountain in spring, talking to the makers, the incredible work that's involved, the time, the restraints, the late nights and early mornings, and the general solitude that happens when you're making tea on the mountaintop. And really, I think that you guys should probably know by now, this tea is not easy to make. This is one of the most complicated teas, especially if you've been around and you've listened to the other tea-making podcast episodes I've done, making Bilo Chun, making Dragonwell, making the white teas. You'll know that this has a lot more processes involved. And so in this episode, what I want to do is take the other side of the Dancong Oolong production and get into Dancong Oolong drinking. How do they drink this tea in Chaozhou? How do the farmers drink this tea? How are they brewing it? How are they enjoying it? What do they think of it? This episode will be really focused on the modern Chaozhou Gongfu process. If you're interested in the historical processes, check out episode 16 where I talk about the history of Dancong Oolong and the history of brewing tea in the Chaozhou Gongfu style. In this episode, I'm going to take a modern look about my time in Chaozhou in 2021 and how they're brewing this iconic, wonderful, complex tea. Now, in my opinion, Dancong Oolong has to be one of the most difficult to brew Chinese teas there is. This tea is the epitomization of the Gongfu cha methodology because you need great skill in order to brew it. I mean, in fact, this is where Gongfu cha originated, in this Chaozhou region, in the southern Chuanzhou and the southern Fujian region, where you have teas that are very, very strong, teas that have this potentiality, this propensity towards intense bitterness. And to do that, to manipulate it, you have to brew it very quickly, flash infusions a small amount, and pour in the water, pour out the water very, very quickly. And as we saw in the Chaozhou Gongfu history episode, we talk about how this was a new innovation that came around the scene a little later in like the mid 1800s or something like that, when people started catching on to it. And so people realized they can take this and put it into different types of tea. And, you know, if you tried to brew raw pu'er, fresh young raw pu'er, without any time constraint on it, it would get incredibly bitter. And so as soon as you're using smaller vessels, controlled time, very, very meticulous methods of brewing your tea, then you can actually get to the gemstone soul of these teas. And in my opinion, the stronger the tea is, the more bitter it is, the more potential it has for something to become really beautiful. And so these kind of powerful teas, if carefully controlled when brewing, you can really make it shine like diamonds in the sun if you're really doing it right. But again, it takes practice, it takes skill, hence the Gongfu cha. And so this also makes me think of the Carl Jung quote where, you know, for a tree to grow to heaven, its roots must reach to hell. A tea like Dancong and raw pu'er, the only way they can be so transcendent is if they have this potentiality for incredible bitterness. And I think what's so amazing is if you're brewing tea in this Gongfu style, you can unlock Heaven's Gate in this teapot, in this tea gaiwan, in these tea leaves where they have this incredible potential, but you have to hit all the right notes at the right time. And so we'll kind of get into the methodology behind that, my methodology, the historical methodology, and all that. But this is one of the main reasons I really love brewing tea because, like, unlike a lot of other beverages like wine or beer or whiskey, the whole control of the beverage is in your hand. With like all those other things, the wine, beer, whiskey, it's all pre made, bottled, and you're supposed to consume it just as it is. With tea, you're given all of the tools you need to extricate exactly the flavor you want. And depending on the different type of situation, depending on your mood, depending on a lot of elements, you can brew the same tea so many different ways. And so just with the raw leaf at your disposal, you have all of the power. And I think that's what really makes the Gongfu brewing something worthy of a lifetime of research and development. I mean, this level of control and freedom would be like if you went to a music concert and the musician just handed out sheet music and instruments to you and was like, okay, like put it all together yourself. You can put a little stress on different notes and everything, but just stick to the music. That's what having this raw tea is like. That analogy actually just reminded me of a scene from Love in a Time of Cholera, a book by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, where he's one of the characters. This is before the advent of a lot of phonographs, like the means to reproduce music and record music. And so what would happen is incredible composers would write down the music and just disseminate it, and people would be able to read music. They'd get it and they'd look at it and they'd read it and then kind of build the scene in their own heads. Like that's like what I feel like I'm doing when I'm sending tea leaves to people. Naturally, there is a certain higher level of control with the tea, how it's made, how it's picked, the quality of the garden, and everything. However, there's this pretty big sensation of existential ennui involved in I don't know how people are going to perceive this tea, how they're going to brew the tea. This session that I'm having right now when I'm testing this tea is going to be different from how other people will perceive it and drink it. And there's no way to share the exact session, the exact tea. And so sometimes it does feel like the artist dilemma, the author dilemma. Like when you create a work of art and you send it out into the public, you don't have a control on how it makes people feel. People have to come up with their own opinions on it. And sometimes you'll just sit in the background and be like, no, that's wrong. But then it's like, is any perception of it wrong? It's all right because they're all true, genuine perceptions. But what we can do here, what I want to do is kind of emphasize how to make the most out of the tea, how to get away from the bad perceptions of your tea, and how to drink the tea in a close way to how it's being drunk on the mountain by the makers, how it's being drunk by me here in China when I'm tasting them. That way you can get a little closer to the truth or the intended truth behind the tea itself. And so let's start out by talking about the most important element of brewing tea other than the tea itself, and that's going to be the water. And the discussion about the best type of water for brewing tea goes back 1,000 years, goes back to beyond 1,000 years to Lu Yu in the 700 AD. He's talking about the best places for water, and he says, I believe the best water comes from natural springs, and this is something that we still see to this day. It's pretty well established. The best water for tea is spring water. Water from natural springs are rich in minerals, slightly alkaline, and they're just great to the taste. I've had some really amazing, excellent spring water that's almost effervescent. It's so incredibly buoyant on the tongue, thick and oily, and this is just sweet, and this is just the water itself. And so sometimes, we've heard this saying before, tea on the mountain tastes better than tea in the village. And this is usually because the water they're using is different. So if you have a clean source of natural spring water and you are in the practice of drinking Gongfu tea, then carve yourself out a little time every week or so, get a couple really big jugs, and go out there, fill up your jugs, and come back. Like, this is what they do in China when they live near Hangzhou in the Westlake area. People will go to one of the famous springs and just fill up, 5-gallon jugs of water, 3, 4, 5 of them, and then take them back. And they'll do this every week, every other week, or something like that. However, if you don't have access to a real natural spring, a lot of the bottled water you can buy is spring water. And so make sure you're looking for the spring water and not the purified water or distilled water. The differences here is the spring water is usually coming from an aquifer underground. It's purified by the rocks and the minerals in the ground, and it's very, very natural. This purified water sometimes is distilled water that they've remineralized. And the remineralization step is really essential because you really, really don't want to drink or to use pure distilled water. Pure distilled water is a freak of nature. It's this science kind of water that's okay, we need this to be absolutely devoid of anything. But that's not what water should be like. Water, I've heard distilled water is like hungry water because water has a huge potential to absorb minerals and to be saturated. And so if you're using distilled water with your tea, it will absorb a lot of the fragrances, a lot of the flavors, and give you back very, very little. Now, I know there are some water warriors out there. I've read their forums on message boards and stuff like that, that they're getting distilled water and then remineralizing it themselves with detailed recipes with really great results. And I think this is really fascinating, really incredible, and just another insight into the depthless world of tea. You can really customize everything from the tea you drink, the way you brew it, even the minerals in your base water. And now, personally, I really don't like the waste involved with bottled water. And so, if you can, get a reusable jug, see if you can refill that at a store somewhere near. But if you're entirely against the commodification of water, because water is essential, I think using tap water is still viable. I don't know what a lot of you tea heads out there will think about using tap water for brewing your tea, and I hope a lot of you kind of are offended by this idea, but I will be the first to admit my guilt here. In China, you actually can't even drink the tap water without boiling it. And so I've had to kind of define my life based on how am I getting clean sources of water here in China. And I will admit, like, I've just drank boiled tap water quite a bit. And there was a time I didn't want to buy more water. I didn't want to buy bottles of it. And I was just drinking boiled tap water. And then if you're already boiling your tap water, you're that much closer to drinking tea. And so if you think about the history of potability of different beverages, of water and things in the past, you know, in Europe, in the West, beer was often used as a means to make water more potable. Here, so too, tea potentially had that extra avenue where if you're already boiling your water because you should boil your water and not get sick, and then you're drinking your tea, tea is going to be healthier than just drinking unboiled water, right? That said, in my opinion, drinking tea with tap water isn't going to kill you, but if you really want to experience the full range of the tea, you really should be using higher quality water. You should be using at least purified water, potentially even spring water if you can. And this is another realistic issue with avoiding tap water. Sometimes the purification methods often involve different chemicals, chlorine and other things. And these intense chemicals will linger over in the taste of the water and can in turn affect the taste of the tea. So tap water is likely to kill some of the nuances of your tea. So if you can, do avoid it. And if you're drinking expensive teas, really, really just go all in for the spring water, not the tap water. Now, here in China, almost every tea house will be using spring water. They'll have huge refillable jugs that sit under their table and are siphoned up into their electric kettles. And this is going back to the Dragon Well episode. There's the saying, "Hao cha pei hao shui, hao ma pei hao an," which is like pair good tea with good water, pair a good horse with a good saddle. If you're drinking nice things, you should be using the best quality water you can. Otherwise, you're really detracting from the whole experience of it. And I've been to different tea houses, those with a connection to the mountain, with the farms. Usually they're not using commercial spring water. They're using water from the actual mountain itself. And they'll have minivans that come down every week or so, just filled with jugs of spring water from the mountaintop. And it's really amazing because I've been to so many mountains where I can see the spring that's being tapped and tubed into the tea room. And there's just troughs of it, there's streams of it, there's flowing of it. It's very much a part of life up there sometimes. They'll wash their vegetables with it. They'll cook their rice with it. I've washed my hands, my face, brushed my teeth with it. it's really just a staple of it. And so if you can get this local mountain spring water, it's usually the best. And this goes back to the saying, tea tastes better on the mountain. And man, some of the different mountain springs just taste better. Like the Wudong Mountain Spring is amazing. It's one of my favorite mountain spring waters I've had so far. And that's the Wudong Mountain, the Dancong Oolong area. But again, this obsession with water, particularly with mountain spring water, is huge in the tea world. I remember visiting a tea factory in Monghai with Paul, and he was telling me that he really appreciates this factory when they're fermenting his pu'er, when they're making the raw pu'er into ripe pu'er, because they'll actually use mountain spring water. And he pointed out the minivan that was just full of these bottles, these jugs of water, because if you're making a huge amount of show pu'er, you need a lot of water. And some factories will just use the tap water, just use local water, whatever. This one factory is using the mountain spring water, which supposedly creates a sweeter tea. And so if you're interested in trying out some of this cooked pu'er that was actually fermented with mountain spring water, do check out Y2T's offering. I know Paul doesn't really talk about this very much, but he's doing a lot of really good stuff behind the scenes, and he's just not even telling you guys what he's actually doing. So I have a huge amount of respect for that kind of stuff. So for most of China, the name of the game is Nongfu spring water. This is the commercially available water that's a lot of people use. This is what I use in my apartment when I'm drinking my teas. And I think they get their sources from a few different aquifers, but the main one is actually pretty close to the Wui Mountains, I believe. Anyways, I'm probably going way too deep into water. This is not the water episode, and maybe one day I can get one of these water wizards from the forums on to be a guest, and he or she can enlighten us on the experimentations and the experiences of home crafted water. Until then, let's get back to the source of this tangent, which is really just how to experience the tea, how to drink the tea as it is intended, how it's drank by the farmers on the mountain, how it's drank by me when I'm sourcing. And as I mentioned, the first important thing is the source of the water, the quality of the water. Now, all I can really do as a vendor is select teas that perform well how I brew them, with my temperatures, with my teaware, with my settings and ratios and all that. Another thing I can do is source out, teas from good environments, teas from the core regions, teas made by competent masters, teas that have undergone all the proper steps, and then they perform well under my brewing parameters. That said, there could be a world of difference between how I'm brewing this tea and how anyone who buys these teas is brewing them. I remember watching, I won't say his name, somebody was brewing tea on a YouTube channel, somebody with a tea company, and I was looking at how they're brewing it, and I'm like, oh my God, what are they doing? And it terrified me. And I was like, is this how this guy drinks his tea? I was horrified. And I just realized like that was that existential crisis where I'm like, oh my God, are people brewing tea like this? And this is like, somebody who's been drinking quite a bit of tea, and maybe it's his tasting methods and not actually his drinking for pleasure methods. Anyways, that said, waving aside this sense that we can never know each other, we can never share the same session, that no one will ever experience the exact teas I experiences. Anyways, let's talk about Dancong Oolong. And so when I'm brewing Dancong, I'm using spring water. I'm using the highest quality water I can. Another question I get asked is, what's the temperature for water when you're brewing it? If you remember the episode in Chaozhou, talking about the Chaozhou Gongfu tea ceremony, you'll remember that one of the main accoutrements for brewing tea is a ceramic stove with a charcoal pit, hot charcoal that's heating up your water kettle. Your water kettle could be made of clay, it could be made of unglazed Juni clay, but the point here is that part of the tea session you have water that's boiling or simmering, slightly bubbling almost the entire time you're brewing this tea. Thus, Dancong Oolong does best with tea that is literally right off the boil, tea that is literally lightly simmering. And I remember brewing tea with Master Wei one of these years. I think it was way back in like 2019 or something. And I was brewing tea on the mountain, just drinking the Mao Cha as he was running around doing the production. And one of his customers came in, and I'm sitting behind the tea table, and Master Wei's just like, oh, just like brew him some tea. And so I just casually brew him tea. And then Wei comes over. He's like, what are you doing? And I was like, I'm brewing tea. He's like, the water's not hot. And I'm like, it just boiled. He's like, it's not boiling though. Boil it every time before every infusion. And I was like, really? And he's like, yes, it should always be bubbling. And I was like, oh, okay, sorry. And he's a little upset because like this is me showing off his teas in the wrong way, which is exactly what we're talking about in this episode, where I'm like, are people getting the same experience out of this tea? That said, while Dancong Oolong is traditionally brewed with simmering water, with boiling water, I like to experiment with different temperatures as I'm brewing them. And sometimes I like it a little cooler, like 90 degrees or something. Sometimes I feel like that gives you a little more texture, a little more fragrance and stuff. But really, traditionally, it's brewed with boiling, bubbling water. So, as I mentioned in episode 16, I talk all about the Chaozhou Gongfu tea ceremony, not ceremony, the procedure of how it's brewed, this Gongfu cha ideology that spread throughout China, and how it originated in western Fujian. In the north, you have the Wui Mountains. In the south, you have the Phoenix Mountain Range and the Chuanzhou, the Anxi Oolongs, the Tieguanyins. And in this region, they were drinking tea in very small vessels out of very small cups. And so those are two of the main things, the small brewing vessel and the small drinking chabe, the cup. Usually the cup is about 30 milliliters, and the drinking vessel or the brewing vessel is usually between 80 and 120 milliliters. And so, by Western standards, this is incredibly small. Even in China, they were at this time, at the very early time of Gongfu tea, of the loose leaf tea, Zhuyuanzhang in the Ming Dynasty, they were drinking in larger teapots usually. This is the Yixing teapot, usually about 200 milliliters, 250 milliliters. And then you get down south in Fujian, and they're using incredibly small things. That said, there's another question. Were they using gaiwans or were they using teapots in Chaozhou? Because you know Chaozhou has their own style of wheel-thrown teapots. This is the Juni, the Chaozhou Juni. And these are usually very small, 80 milliliters, 120 milliliters. However, this is relatively modern. I was talking to a lot of the tea makers or teapot makers, potters down in Chaozhou, and they're saying back in the 90s and everything, the stuff that they were making was just not good. There was no export value for it. Not a lot of people were interested in the actual Chaozhou Juni teapots. It wasn't until, late 90s, early 2000s when Xie and a group of people started reinventing Chaozhou teaware, Chaozhou teapots and stuff like that. Before that, it was just not very, very common. And so most people were using gaiwans. And a lot of people to this day, I would say 85-90% of people in Chaozhou brewing Dancong Oolong tea are using very, very small gaiwans. And their gaiwans, this is particularly for the tea makers and just the common people, they're using the cheapest gaiwans, unadorned, just white porcelain, and the cheapest, smallest cups. And they have like hundreds of these tiny, tiny cups. But at all times, they're only using 3 cups. We'll talk about these 3 cups here in a moment, but one thing that I want to mention that I usually don't see involved in the Chaozhou tea ceremony or Chaozhou tea brewing methods is the Gongdao Bei. There is no fairness cup, no justice cup. The tea is usually just poured directly into cups. And so this is one piece of teaware that I very rarely see used in the Chaozhou area. Sometimes I will see it used if they're making teaware, if they're making pottery, like in the Mingde Yuan, this is Xie gallery. They'll use nice wood-fired, wabi-sabi looking gongdao beis, especially for larger parties because they're usually entertaining a large group of people. And so it's not really efficient to only brew in 3 cups. Other times I've seen gongdao beis or something similar used was when I was making teaware with in Kumin's studio. And in his courtyard, we would drink tea, and he would use an empty pot. An empty teapot, maybe one that had the lid broken. That was the gongdao bei. And so we would pour from one teapot into this gongdao sharing teapot that didn't have any tea leaves in it. And then we could kind of save the tea there and pour them out to apprentices as they come out to take a break from throwing pottery if they just want to drink some tea. And so these are kind of the 2 instances where I've seen the gongdao bei used, but usually the tea is just poured directly into 3 small 30 milliliter cups. Now, here's one key point of drinking Dancong Oolong in Chaozhou: 3 cups. This is very, very popular in the cultural language of the Chaozhou Gongfu tea brewing methods. Is they're only going to be using 3 cups, and it doesn't matter how many people are drinking tea, there are always going to be 3 cups. Now, this is the rule. So I was living in Chaozhou all of 2021, and I saw this in practice time and time again. Almost 85% of the time, I would see people only brewing out of 3 cups, only brewing into 3 cups. The guy at the convenience store, I'd go in there and he'd have his big teapot and his gaiwan set up next to the register, and he would always have 3 cups there. And he would always fill them up with every brew. And then usually what happens if you're drinking tea by yourself with 3 cups, what you do is you have 1 cup that you always use, and you drink that one dry. And then you take another cup and you pour that cup of tea into your cup, and then you drink it. Then you take the 3rd cup and pour it into your cup. And then if somebody else comes by, then you still pour into 3 cups. You give them 1 cup, you drink 1 cup, and then with that extra cup of tea, you split it between the two of you. This is what would happen when I was drinking tea with Kum and Laosher, and it was just me and him. We would drink out of 3 cups, and then he would pour the 3rd cup into each of our cups when we were done. Another thing that you're supposed to be doing here is rinsing the tea, washing the teaware after every infusion. And so there's a lot of water waste going on. So Chaozhou brewing is definitely wet brewing, where you should have a tea table, a tea tray, or something that can absorb a lot of water, because you pour in water to all the cups. Then you take the cups. This is the very traditional Chaozhou way. You take the cups with your 2 fingers, your middle finger and your thumb, and you put 1 cup in the next cup in a perpendicular fashion, and you rotate the cup, rotate the cup, and clean all the edges of it. And this is really difficult because you're using this with boiling water. And so this is kind of one of the shows that, like, yeah, I know how to brew Chaozhou Gongfu. I can even wash the cups with my hands like this. If you can do that, it's very didao, very authentic. And so they'll rinse the cups between every infusion, fill it up with tea, then drink it, and then rinse the cups again with hot water. This is very useful if you're drinking tea with more than 3 people, because more than 3 people, you pour the tea, give the tea to the 3 people, then they drink it, give them back, you rinse the cups, and then you give those same cups to 3 different people. And so really, if you're drinking tea with more than 3 people, it's a method of slowing down the session. Every time the teaware gets to you, every time a tea cup full of tea gets to you, you're more excited for it. You really, really cherish it. Drinking tea like this with only 3 cups and maybe like 6 or 7 people, it reminds me of one time I went to a Michelin star sushi restaurant in Taipei. And this was a tiny, tiny restaurant. It had like 8 seats. But the thing is, there was only one Michelin chef there who would make all the sushi. And so he would stand behind the bar. 8 people would sit at the bar kind of looking at him. And then he would make sushi piece by piece. And he would really, really delicately like cut the fish, set it on the bed of rice, add a little bit of wasabi, and then delicately place it on somebody's plate. And then he would make the next piece. And so you would have a meal of like, half a dozen pieces of sushi, maybe a dozen pieces of sushi, and you would have to wait for each one and savor it. And so this is kind of what it feels like when you're drinking this Chaozhou Gongfu tea with 6 people, with 4 people, with 8 people. You're always kind of waiting your turn, and then when the tea gets to you, you really have this heightened level of appreciation, in my opinion. So it is very much a rule for Chaozhou Gongfu tea to use 3 cups, to always have 3 cups, no matter how many people are drinking tea. Now the question here is, why 3 cups? The reasoning behind these 3 cups is actually very symbolic. I couldn't find a lot of traditional, historical, legendary accounts of why, but a lot of people are justifying it in different ways. So here's one of the methods of justification for using 3 cups. If you know anything about the Chinese written language, you'll know that the character for mouth consists of a single square. This is 4 lines in a box configuration, and the word mouth is also used for people. For example, a country's population is the Renkou. Ren is people, Ko is mouth. So how many people are in your country is how many people mouths are in your country. What's the population? For a family, how many people are in your family? The Ko is also the measure word for it. So if you have 5 people in your family, you have 5 mouths to feed. You have 5 mouths in your family. And so thinking about drinking tea, the teacup itself looks like a mouth, and then you have 3 teacups. There's another saying, I think it's 三茶四酒二铁饕, and that kind of means 3 people are suitable for tea, 4 people are suitable for wine, 2 people are suitable for travel. And this is kind of what to do with different groups of people. And so the fact that you have 3 mouths that look like 3 people and 3 people are suitable for tea, it all really, really suits itself for it. Additionally, in the Chinese language, if you write 3 boxes in a triangular configuration like a pyramid, you get a new character. So you write mouth 3 times and stack them on top of each other. This character means to taste. It's naturally very well suited for tea, but also if you remember in the very first episode of Tea Soup, we talk about how this notion of taste with regards to tea arose in the old dynasties as a way to distinguish yourself from the common masses slurping teas. If you can actually have a discerning taste, you can appreciate the loftier things in this world, you're essentially of a higher class than most people. And so the idea of tasting tea is definitely one of refined culture and whatnot. And finally, there's one more set of 3s that go in here. The cup itself is 30 milliliters, and usually in Chaozhou, you're supposed to drink it with 3 sips. Supposedly, the first sip is sour, the second sip is bitter, and the third sip is sweet. But I've heard 3 sips is used to drink tea all throughout China, and this might be what we talked about in the Chaozhou episode 16, this daibiao, this taken from China and spread out through the rest of the Chinese world and culture. But the 3 sips for every cup of tea is usually pretty common. My tea master taught me here in Jiangsu, where it's like the first sip, you're supposed to aerate. And the first sip, you really get the smell of the tea. The second sip, you wash around your mouth and you really get the mouthfeel and texture of the tea. And then the third sip, you just enjoy the tea. So that's kind of how he has broken it up. So we see in the Chaozhou Gongfu tea session, you have 3 cups, 3 people, 30 milliliters of tea. You're drinking them 3 times with each cup. And so what's interesting here is 3 is very numerologically powerful. It's the birth of society, the birth of a family. If you think about this numerologically, from a union of 2 people comes a third. And so with that creation of a third, you get this birth of limitless creative potential. It reminds me of the 42nd chapter of the Tao Te Ching. Dao sheng yi, yi sheng er sheng san, san sheng wang wu. Which is to say, the Tao gave birth to 1, 1 gave birth to 2, 2 gave birth to 3, and 3 gave birth to the 10,000 things, which is the whole material universe. And so you see here, 3 is the beginning of society. And what is drinking tea other than a cultural societal thing? And getting back to this, the Tao Te Ching quote, there's also another clear visualization of this represented in the yin-yang. You probably know the yin-yang symbol, right? One side is dark and one side is light. And so the saying here with the yin-yang is behind the yin-yang. The yin-yang arises from the taiji. The taiji is the great ultimate. It's this whole circle that's pure and unbroken. And the taiji sits on the wuji. The wuji is the great void. And so here we can kind of see in this cosmology, it's almost one-to-one, where the wuji represents the Tao. The taiji represents 1, the yin-yang represents 2, and then the interactions of the yin-yang coalesce, compete to create the entire material universe. Everything we see is an admixture of yin and yang energies, but in truth, everything is also one. It all comes from the same source, and that source sits on the great void. And so this is interesting too, because this is part of the reason behind the name for One River tea. For us, tea it looks so different. There's so many myriad different types of tea, different cultures, different tastes, different flavors, and yet it all comes from the same source. It is all Chinese tea or Camellia sinensis, and of course you can get these smaller varietals, but really what's happening here, it's the same leaf. It's just a difference of how it's processed after it's picked. And so that's why we chose the name One River tea, because on the surface, everything looks so convoluted, so different, so distinct. And yet in truth, everything is one. Everything is the same thing, just a different guise on it. Anyways, getting back to the Chaozhou tea session, how they're drinking tea, they're usually using 3 cups in their session, but as is my want, I want to bring up the idea that why are they using 3 cups? Is it merely symbolic? Is there actual practicality to it? Does it make the session more or less enjoyable? And so some of the reasons, let's talk about the pros for using 3 cups. One, Dancong is very, very strong. You don't want to drink that much Dancong. I'll let you know that because I just came off of, 3-4 week bender of just drinking Dancong, tasting them to get the release out. And yeah, they would wreck my days after drinking like 6, 7 different Dancongs in the matter of 4 hours. And so if you're drinking them out of small cups, it's a little more manageable. And then, as I mentioned, with waiting for a single cup of tea, a very small single cup of tea, it builds the appreciation of it. If you have, 62 ounces of tea, you're going to enjoy that in a very different way, where if you have 30 milliliters instead. Another thing that I really like about this is you get to experience the warm cup, the hot tea. It doesn't really go cool, or actually, it goes cool very, very quickly, but you're still drinking tea at a very high temperature. It's not, if you're drinking out of a big cup, the first couple sips will be hot, and then it gets significantly colder by the time you're done with it. With a small cup, it usually stays pretty hot the entire time. The next thing I like is the aroma you get off of the empty cup. And so if you put in hot tea, drink it very quickly, there's a certain level of tea and tea oils that are on the base of the cup, lining the cup, that are slowly aerosolizing. And as they aerosolize, they emit these beautiful fragrances. And if the tea is hot at that time, you get this really nice curve of sensation of smells that evolve from the empty cup. And so for me, I just love smelling the empty cup, and it usually works better if it is hot. If it's cold tea that you drink, you really won't get a lot of smell out of it. And so using the smaller cups gives you a little more olfactory sensations. It lets you drink hotter tea, and it lets you cherish the tea more. Conversely, it is kind of annoying. I mean, having only such a small amount of tea and everything, always using 3 cups and not using the Gongdao Bei. A bad thing about this is the idea that the Gongdao Bei helps you stop the steep time. If you're brewing out of a gaiwan and you pour and you're doing a 5 second steep, you pour the tea into the first cup. That tea is relatively light. You pour it into the second cup, it gets a little stronger. You pour it into the third cup, 15 seconds have passed, and the cup at the end is significantly stronger. The tea in the cup at the end is significantly stronger than the tea at the start. And so one solution is to pour it into all 3 cups in a circular motion multiple times so that all kind of teas get this blend of the different strengths of the tea. But how much better, how much easier would that be if you just poured it into a Gongdao Bei? And so for me, when I'm drinking tea at home, I'm usually just using a Gongdao Bei. I'm not using 3 cups, even if I'm drinking Chaozhou Gongfu tea, because I don't think brewing Chaozhou Gongfu tea, Dancong cha, with 3 cups, I don't think it makes it any significantly better than using a Gongdao Bei. And so for me, it's kind of hit or miss. It's here or there. I can do it both ways. I don't really prefer one over the other. Actually, I do prefer brewing out of a Gongdao Bei instead of the 3 cups, but I don't really dislike brewing out of 3 cups. So that said, common practice in Chaozhou, like the way the young people drink tea, nobody is using a Gongdao Bei. Everyone's just using the 3 cups. And let's talk a little more about how the youth, how the common people are just drinking tea in Chaozhou, because this is where I see a big difference from Chaozhou and the rest of China. A lot of the rest of China, they're drinking very casual. They're doing the grandpa style. They're drinking a lot of milk teas. In Chaozhou, even the young people are still brewing tea Gongfu style. In everyone's home, they have the Gongfu tea set up right on their kitchen table, their coffee table, if you will. It becomes like their tea table, right? And they usually have all of the epiquage, to quote Lu Yu. They have the nice electric kettle. They have the water tub that siphons water up. They have the tray that siphons water down. They have the wastewater bucket. They have the whole shebang. And this is just super, super common. I remember walking around the old town with my teacher, and he would just knock on doors, walk in, and there'd just be old people drinking tea, young people watching TV, drinking tea, all around the same table. And so it's just incredibly, incredibly common. I think I mentioned when I moved to Chaozhou, that was the first time I really had that experience of, wow, this is Chinese tea culture. I actually had it as well when I traveled through Xiamen, through Amoy, because that area of southern coastal Fujian, down the coast from Fuzhou and Fuding, that's where you get the Anxi Tieguan Yin, and that culture is really thick, really deep. Everyone has a fridge full of their favorite Anxi Tieguan Yin, the green stuff. Everyone's brewing tea outside. The old people, the young people, the security guards outside of the hotel. I have some really great videos of my time there, and it was just really cool seeing how in this region in particular, tea culture is a way of life. And where you go traveling through China, you see a lot of different cultures, a lot of old history, a lot of old traditions, and a lot of times, a lot of modern places are trying to capitalize on these old traditions. And so literally every Chinese city will have an old town, and their old town is or an old street, and the old street is just a modern remake of what it would look like in like the Song dynasty or the Ming dynasty. And they're doing things according to how life would be like in the Ming dynasty, and you can see this kind of pretentious reenactment of an old tradition. In Chaozhou, in Chuanzhou, in that region, the Gongfu tea is not an old extinct tradition. It is the living culture that's always been present and just always really, really tangible there. And so one thing here is there's a famous saying, you've probably heard of it. It's better to go 3 days without rice than 1 day without tea. And no one really knows who who said this originally, but there's a quote from the Qing dynasty emperor Qianlong, which is probably where this quote came from. He says, like, a gentleman should not go 1 day without tea. And so this is just like, tea is so important. I remember telling you guys we have these tea ration cards. When you were rationing your meat, your oil, your fabric, you would also get a tea ration card because it's just such a daily staple. As a result, though, when you take something like tea, which for the Western world, especially for Dancong tea, Westerners view Dancong tea as something a little exotic, hard to obtain, not very common. In Chaozhou, it is so common that people don't even really think about it. And so I remember drinking tea so many times, and I asked them, what's the cultivar? What's the Pingzhong? What's the varietal? And they don't know. They look at the box and they're like, I don't know. And I'm like, where'd you get it? And they're like, a friend gave it to me. And I'm like, oh. And where did they say anything about it? They're like, no, they said it was good tea. And I'm like, okay, so we're drinking good tea. The amount of times somebody could tell me the cultivar were very few. I could count them on a hand. And even me, when I would bring things like the autumn harvest of a yashishang, like the qingxiang yashishang, the shuipian, the snowflake harvest of the yashishang, I'd bring this into the studio where everyone's making teapots, people born and raised in Chaozhou, and they're asking me questions about the tea. They're like, wow, I've never had such a fragrant dancong. What is this? And I'm like, guys, like, this is your tea. This is your culture. But it's just a very, very different thing where tea becomes part of life. It's just stitched into the fabric of reality, and you're not really questioning it. You're not looking too deeply into it. Thus, there's this interesting dichotomy where it is really deep in the tea culture world, but it's not deep in the tea nerdom world. Like, people aren't geeking out about the Dancong tea. They're just drinking tea every day, all the time. It's just part of life. And sometimes they have this, oh, this is good tea, this is not so good tea, this is just basic tea, but they will drink whatever tea you put in front of them as long as it's Dancong. Another thing, I'm definitely running out of time here, so I think I'll probably have to cut this episode and talk about how I drink Dancong Oolong and some tips on how you can get the best out of your Dancong Oolong in the next episode. In this episode, I'll just keep talking about modern Chaozhou Gongfu tea culture because I guess I took a long tangent on water. Anyways, it was all pretty interesting. One thing I want to talk about in Chaozhou and in Chuanzhou as well, where they do the Anxi Tieguan Yin, is the amount of tea that they're using in the gaiwan. And this is, I think you guys probably know what I'm getting at here. They use like 100 milliliter gaiwan and they overpack it. They put so much tea in there. They probably put 7 or 8 grams of tea in there. It's not an absurd amount. In Anxi with the tea farmers, they do kind of put an absurd amount in there. Probably like 10 to 12 grams. I'm not even kidding. Like, it overflows. The tea leaves in Chuanzhou and Anxi Teguanyan, when they brew it, the lid can't fit on the gaiwan anymore after a few infusions because the leaves have just expanded so much. In Chaozhou, it's not like that. In Chaozhou, yeah, they put a lot of tea in there, probably like 7 or 8 grams of it, and nobody's using a scale. Everyone's just eyeballing it, throwing tea in there, and then brewing it. It's usually very strong, and they'll switch the tea out really quick. They'll brew a few infusions and then swap the tea. And if somebody new comes, they'll switch out, they'll dump out the old tea. Even if they've only had a few infusions, they'll dump out the old tea and then start brewing some new ones. So yeah, no one's using a scale. Everyone's putting a little too much tea in the gaiwan. Very few people are using teapots, and nobody at all is crushing leaves. This is just how they're brewing the tea in Chaozhou, in most of the places, and 95% of the places. Old people, young people, new people, people have been brewing tea all their lives. This is what I've seen. Another thing, like I mentioned, they're using the either charcoal burning stoves, boiling water every time. They're using high quality purified water, and they're drinking whatever dancong they can. They're really, really not very picky. The only people who really know the cultivars are the people who are selling the tea or the people who are making the tea. The people who are drinking the tea, a lot of the people, they're very, very few people that really know their cultivars. Of course, you get tea nerds everywhere, but really it's probably the frequency of tea nerds there is still not so high as you would expect. A lot of people just look at tea as you would look at any just very, very, very common drink in your own country. One awesome thing that I loved about Chaozhou that I wish I saw more throughout China and the rest of the world are these automatic 24-hour self-service tea rooms. And you just scan a code, you pay a fee, you go in there, and it's just one small little tea room with everything you need to brew tea. And you can just spend an hour there. You can rent it by the hour. And you can just go there, you can study, you can drink tea. The atmosphere is great. There's nobody you have to talk to. It's never any crowded because it's just you, your friends, or whatever. So I really love that element of Chaozhou, and I wish I could see it in more places. I think it would do really, really well. So anyways, thank you guys for joining this episode. It's all about Chaozhou Gongfu tea, the modern rendition of it, how people are actually drinking tea in Chaozhou now. In the next episode, I will talk about Dancong Oolong, how I drink it, how I suggest you can drink it, and give you tips on finding your favorite cultivar, the price range you kind of want to look for, and the price range that I see from buying the tea. So that should be a really informative episode and a little more free verse of my experiences, my perceptions, my ideas. So again, this is Derek from Whatever Tea. Thank you guys so much for listening. Thank you all who have bought tea from the site, these Dancong Oolongs from Wenzitong and Wudongshan. This year, I think the Dansongs are absolutely fantastic. So I can't wait to get those teas into your gaiwans and hear what you guys think. Until next time, guys, Derek from Whatever Tea. Brew happy.